Hi everyone, today we're going to examine the differences between a hardtail and full suspension. We're just going to discuss it and whether which one is going to be right for you, maybe your first bike or an upgrade from your current bike. My two personal bikes are a Giant Trance 3 and a Specialized Rockhopper 29. The Giant Trance is a 2016 model variant and the Rockhopper 29 is a 2015 model variant. The Rockhopper is what really got me into the sport of mountain biking. I started from road, and then I decided to kind of branch off into MTB to get the extra kind of technical experience that you don't really get on the road, and I ended up really enjoying it a lot. So we're just going to examine the two bikes and kind of see what the difference is. We're just going to talk about it. I don't have the two bikes with me right now, but this is also one of my favorite trails, one of my favorite descents, so that's why you see it in so many of the videos, is because I go there a lot. But this first bike here that I'm going to show you, this is just a picture of my Giant Trance 3. This is one of my favorite bikes I think I've ever ridden. Compare it to the next bike that I have, which is the Rockhopper 29 from Specialized. That's it on the right there. I mean, they're two very, very different bikes. The Giant Trance 3 is essentially a mid to long travel trail bike. It's not an enduro bike. It's only 140 mil travel front and rear, about 5.5 inches. Enduro usually starts at about 160 millimeters travel front and rear, just to get the extra shock absorption from drops and launches. So the main difference, of course, is that addition of the rear shock. What that rear shock allows you to do is have better rear wheel tracking. So as you're going over rougher terrain, that rear wheel is essentially going to be forced into the ground on a full suspension bike by that rear suspension, because you have a preload, pre-sag, that when you sit on the bike, the suspension compresses a little, which means that there's always going to be a positive force against the ground, pushing into it, helping get you better traction as you go over rougher, looser terrain. Whereas on a hardtail, you don't have that. The ride's a little more harsh depending on the frame material. Aluminum is a little harsh as far as frame goes, but I mean certain steels. I mean, it really depends on who makes your frame too, not necessarily just the material. But the hardtail doesn't have that constant positive force into the ground, so your traction isn't going to be as great on a hardtail. That's one of the many benefits to that full suspension. The Rockhopper 29 that I have is a 100 millimeter coil sprung fork in the front, so just your entry level 29er with hydraulic disc brakes. The other thing you're going to notice when shopping for full suspension bikes is the choice between Fox or RockShox shock and front suspension fork. The big difference is just price. Fox is always going to be more expensive for a comparable setup versus RockShox. The Fox components are also slightly more complicated to work on than the RockShox, hence why Fox is such a big stickler for having you send in the forks or shock for service, versus RockShox, which you can usually get parts through your local bike shop, or your local bike shop will just work on it for you. So, I mean, as your first bike, if you don't know whether or not you're gonna really take off in the sport, I mean, you might want to look at just getting a hardtail. Hardtail kind of teaches you some better technique, I think, than full suspension does. So when you're just starting out, I mean, you really want to get that technique down. Plus, the other big thing is cost. When you're looking at two different bikes, if you're looking at a comparably priced full suspension and comparing it to a similarly priced hardtail, the components on that hardtail are usually going to be higher end components than on the full suspension, because some additional cost is being put towards that full suspension setup in the rear of the bike. Generally on full suspension bikes, you're getting they usually start at like a Dior setup, just your basic Dior, not your XT or XTR Dior setup. But most of the time now it's going to be a Shadow Plus setup with the rear clutch derailleur to help minimize chain drop. But you're also going to see a lot of entry level full suspensions not come with a dropper seat post. I upgraded to a specialized RockShox or specialized command post IRCC just to get that dropper seat post that I didn't get when I got the base level Trance. You're also going to see a lot of times a double chainring instead of a 1x setup on the entry levels. That's mostly due to the fact that the gear ratios are dramatically different in a 10-speed versus an 11-speed setup. So you'll usually spend money on changing over to a 1x also. Now, as far as hardtail goes, as I mentioned, you're going to usually get a better, a bike with better components for the same price you'd spend on a full suspension bike. So if you were to spend $1,500 on your entry-level full suspension bike, which is going to usually be like a giant Stance 2, which has a Ww'll along with, don't remember what the rear mech is, but I know it's a Ww'll shifters, but it's your basic RockShox air fork. The 2016 model featured the XC30 air fork with a Monarch R rear shock, but it was only 120 millimeter travel rear wheel, because shock travel isn't directly related to rear wheel travel. It's how they have the linkages set up. But that's something to explain at a different time. When you're looking to compare it to the same price for a hardtail, you're going to be looking at the kind of something like maybe a Specialized Crave for $1,500, something from Scott Trek in their middle of the road hardtail. So it's going to be if something that price is going to be a pretty lightweight hardtail, it's not going to be a heavier aluminum. It's going to be a relatively lightweight aluminum alloy frame. You're not usually going to find carbon for that price, but you're also going to notice the components are better specs. So it's going to be Dior. Sometimes you'll get Dior XT derailleurs and shifters, along with, rather than being like an off-branded like a Tektro hydraulic disc brake, you're also going to get like a Shimano setup, maybe SRAM Avids, so just higher end stuff for the same price bike, but then you're losing out on that rear suspension. So if you really want that rear suspension, you got to shop wisely and make sure that you're getting the best bike you can for the same money. I know when I was shopping around, a giant Trance was MSRP'd at $2,100 with Dior setup, the RockShox Sector Gold RL fork, and the Monarch R shock, rear shock, versus a $1,900 Camber from Specialized, which is 130 millimeter travel in the 27.5. That was for 2016, not 2017 model year, and the components on it, they weren't Dior components. They were like a Ww'll shifters with, I think it was 9-speed rear versus 10-speed rear cassette, and then it was still a 2x, but the fork on it also wasn't as great a fork. The rear shock wasn't as great a rear shock either. It was a X Fusion, which are extremely hard to find replacement parts to switch it over to, like a RockShox rear shock, or like even a Fox rear shock. But you're definitely getting better components for the same price in a hardtail. So if you're pretty much like looking on a budget, you have a pretty good idea of what you want, and you're just getting into the sport, but you want like a higher end bike to start on, then definitely look at a a middle of the road hardtail, because you're definitely getting better components, a better bike for for the money you'd spend on a cheaper full suspension. If you really enjoy the sport, then it's definitely worth upgrading down the road to a full suspension. But you also need to have the terrain around the house, or around where you're riding, for a full suspension. I mean, not all riding necessitates a full suspension. You'll just be losing power through pedal bob, unless you get a higher end short travel XC full suspension bike, such as maybe a specialized Epic with 100 millimeters of travel and the brain shock in the rear. But then those start at about $3,000. So it's really worthwhile just purchasing a good hardtail for your first bike, in my opinion, versus getting a cheaper full suspension to start on. Down the road, if you really, really love the sport, get a full suspension, keep your hardtail, and then you're going to be set for life. That's just my opinion. I hope you liked the video. Please share it, subscribe, and thanks, and please come back.